In the previous video, we started out by digging into the cultural and artistic benefits of art. If you've not checked that video out, it's a pretty good jumping off point for the whole media analysis thing that we're attempting to do. In this video, we're going to be unpacking these two syllabus dot points: how cultural context and values influence the interpretation of media work, and how media theories are used to interpret audiences' response to media work. To dig into all dot points, but especially this first one, I want to show you a diagram that can act as a foundation for nearly all your media analysis in the course. I don't know if it has a formal name, but I just call it the Triad of analysis. Up here we have the text. This could be a movie, a TV show, a short film, a podcast, a TikTok, a photo, pretty much any piece of media work. Now it could be a single work, like a single photograph, or a single episode of a TV show, or it could be a consistent set of texts, like a series of photos or a TV series. Either way, it's the work itself that is in this section of the triad. Over here is the context. This is all of the stuff that's going on at the time that the text is made. So an example of this might be a photograph from the Vietnam War. Sure, we could analyse the text by itself, the use of colour, light, and symbolic or written codes that might be in there. But if that's where we stop, we still only have a shallow understanding of this image. But when we start to look at the context, the internal factors that led to the war, like the traumatic legacy of French colonialism, the Indochina War of Independence and the subsequent power vacuum, America's role in flaming the civil war that was happening, the larger dynamic of the Cold War between the USSR and the United States, a history of communism in Asia, the American public's profound distaste for the war, the draft, the Korean War, the Second World War, and on and on and on. Context cuts along heaps of different lines as well. Pretty much everything that I just listed before is all historical context. What about cultural context? How would a person brought up in a Vietnamese culture in Vietnam respond to this image? How would a second-generation person brought up in a Vietnamese culture in their family unit, but a Canadian culture outside of the home, respond? This stuff can run deep and cut across so many different intersections of identity, all impacting an audience member's values and attitudes. Which brings us comfortably into the third part of the triad: audience. Let's think for a second about a few different people viewing this image. First, let's consider you, likely a teenage high school student whose familiarity with the Vietnam War probably amounts to, I know it happened, and might stretch to, there were protests about it, I think. But what if you're a Vietnamese Australian and your family were some of the 70,000 people that came to Australia after the Vietnam War? I have to imagine you're having reactions to the photo that a non-Vietnamese person wouldn't be having. Remembering family stories of the journey to Australia, imagining the South Vietnamese flag your family kept up in the house somewhere for years and years and years. Now let's imagine you're a veteran of the Vietnam War and this photo is bringing up memories and probably traumas of your time in that war. The point here is that this work or text has no fixed meaning. What you see and interpret is the end result of all of these different factors from the triad, which all come together at the moment that you perceive it. This triad of analysis is a good framework to keep erected in your brain whenever you need to analyse a media work. Bonus, nearly all of the media dot points that we're going to be break down into these three categories. Speaking of, let's come back to that second dot point from the start of the video. How media theories are used to interpret audience response to media work. We discussed in the previous video how the mass media has become our primary tool for cultural expression, that fundamental human drive we all have. Well, it turns out that a bunch of academics thought this was interesting enough that they probably needed to create a whole new field of study: communications. And as part of communications, they came up with some theories to explain how this whole communication via mass media shebang was happening. The early attempts at this were not great. The OG theory was the hypodermic needle theory, also known as the magic bullet theory. This puts forward the notion that an entity will transmit a message, say a piece of wartime propaganda, to the masses, and that message will be received by that audience unchanged and unaltered. I would hope, based on nothing more than what I've said in this episode so far, you can see why this is not a good framework for explaining mass communication. We've already touched on how context and audience impact how meaning is made when people consume media, for example. The next evolution of media theories was called the TwoStep Theory. Look, this was a new discipline of study. The people who were coming up with this stuff were trying their best. The two-step theory incorporated the idea that society had these things called opinion leaders, people or institutions that had significant influence over the way members of the general public perceived the media. This too is a pretty old school and mostly outdated idea now, which isn't to say that there aren't individuals or institutions that exist which have the ability to influence and distort media messages. This bit definitely is a thing and does happen. But the simplicity of the two-step model simply isn't enough to help conceptualize what's happening in a modern mass media environment. There are literally dozens of theories out there now which purport to explain the mechanisms by which audiences receive messages through the media. A few of the notables for this course include agenda setting theory, spiral of silence, Hall's reception theory, and uses and gratifications theory. Hall's reception theory is a really good place to start because it works the audience into the equation, but also because there's heaps of good resources out there explaining it, like this one from Al Jazeera, this one from a much cooler, much smarter, and unfortunately much more attractive media teacher than me, and best of all, you can go to the source and hear from Stuart Hall himself on what his theory is. It'd be a good idea to pause here and go watch some or all of the videos and then come back. In the spiral of silence theory, the main idea is that people influence each other's willingness to express opinions through social interaction. According to the spiral of silence theory, individuals will be more confident and outward with their opinions when they notice that their personal opinion is shared throughout a group. But if the individual notices that their opinion is unpopular with the group, they will be more inclined to be reserved and remain silent. This theory definitely has its place. It more or less explains how societal norms shift and change over time. If we take a look at LGBTQI+ visibility and broad societal acceptance, we have changed significantly over the last 50 years, and spiral of silence theory offers us a conceptual framework to explain how that happens. As perceived social penalties for being homophobic got higher and higher, people expressed those opinions less and less. There are, however, some conceptual shortcomings to spiral of silence though, the most significant of which is that it was proposed before the advent of the internet. Now, no matter how outside the norm your opinion is, there are user-created spaces and communities available to not only not penalize you, but actively inflate whatever fringe belief you might hold. The incel, pro-ana, and neo-Nazi movements are all pretty striking examples of this. Please be warned, those communities espouse views that advocate for, among other things, murder, suicide, sexual violence, and self-harm. If you want to go digging, please dig very carefully. The other issue with spiral of silence theory is that it doesn't really offer us a very good way to understand the rise of large institutional media makers like News Corp, Breitbart, and Sinclair Group, whose business model is built upon the transition of and amplification of deliberately controversial perspectives. It sure would be nice if the good people had a theory that helped explain these aspects of the media. Enter uses and gratification theory. Uses and gratification theory is an approach to understanding why and how people actively seek out specific media to satisfy specific needs. It flips the dynamic and puts the audience member in the active position and asks, why do people seek out the media and then use it? This theoretical framework provides a helpful explanation for the rise of controversial media empires, the spread of misinformation and disinformation and fake news, as well as the proliferation of conspiracy theories. because the audience is getting a psychological benefit from these pieces of media. Perhaps it's a validation of a perspective or opinion that is seen as bad, or maybe a sense of belonging and validation by peers. And to round out our posse of frameworks, we have agenda setting theory. This one says, the media doesn't tell an audience what to think, but it does make a list of topics that the audience thinks about. Let's unpack that. According to agenda setting theory, there is this thing called the public agenda, basically a big list of all of the most pressing and pertinent things happening in society that we should know about. Take climate change, for example. There was broad scientific consensus on human-driven climate change as far back as the 70s and the 80s. But global warming, as it was known then, didn't really make it onto the public agenda in any significant way until the early 2000s. Then there was an embarrassingly long period of controversy and debate over it that made it onto the public agenda. And it's only really in the last few years that mass media seems relatively aligned on the issue. It's not actually like the science has changed basically at all since the 80s. So why the lag in making it first onto the public agenda and then gaining consensus from media producers? Or think about the opposite issue. There are times when things are kept higher on the public agenda for longer than their societal impact warrants. If you're old enough to be paying attention to the news in Australia in the early 2000s, like I am, you could have been forgiven for thinking that our land was girt by a sea teeming with hordes of illegal line-jumping boat people. Boat people stayed high on the public agenda for the decade running 2000 to 2009. In that time, 11,630 boat people made it to Australia, or 0.05% of the population. By any reasonable measure of significance, boat people was grossly distorted by being kept on the public agenda. Agenda setting theory says that powerful institutions and people exert pressure on the media to keep things on or off the public agenda, impacting what the wider public discusses as the important issues of the day. So, we've got Hall's reception theory, spiral of silence, uses and gratifications, and agenda setting theory. There are literally dozens more, but these four will stand you in good stead for the year ahead. But be warned, the classic mistake heaps of media students make is that they talk about media theories all wrong in their essays. So often I read a response that talks about how such and such director used Hall's reception theory when making their music video or cartoon or video game or film or whatever. This is bad and wrong, and you shouldn't say this. I'm going to say this very slowly and carefully so that you all hear this. The only people who use media theories are people analysing and deconstructing how the media works. They are tools for analysis, not tools for production. I feel like I probably need to make a brief aside here to acknowledge that people making media who have gone through institutions that teach them about these theories probably are making media with an awareness of, and at times even a response to, some of these theories. But for the sake and simplicity of this course, and to ensure you do well in your responses, I'd say leave that level of meta-analysis for later in your life so you can be as unlikable as I was at university parties. So, to recap, these are the 2 dot points that we've covered in this video. How cultural context and values influence the interpretation of media work. How media theories are used to interpret audience response to media work. To see how well you've soaked up all the amazing information I was laying down here, here are some exercises to try. Write down your thoughts of these 2 prompts. Ask yourself how your own cultural context and values influence your interpretation of a movie you've seen recently. Try and pick something that's at least a little bit challenging. Then see if you can use one of the media theories we've discussed as a tool to help interpret how audiences respond to the same text.